The baby's eyes opened as Ezra lifted him from the snow. And for a moment, that stretched like eternity. Time seemed to fracture around them. Those weren't the cloudy blue eyes of a newborn. They shifted like storm clouds gathering on the horizon, gray bleeding into silver, then darkening to the deep purple of twilight. Ezra's breath caught in his throat, forming crystals in the sub-zero air. "Impossible," he whispered, cradling the child against his chest. The baby should have been frozen solid, another tragic casualty of the unforgiving Alaska wilderness. Instead, warmth radiated from the tiny body like a banked fire, seeping through Ezra's threadbare coat and chasing away the bone-deep cold that had been his constant companion. The blizzard howled around them with renewed fury, as if the mountain itself was angry about this disruption to the natural order. Ezra stumbled back toward his cabin, fighting against wind that tried to tear the child from his arms. Each step was a battle, his worn boots sliding on ice that had formed faster than any ice should form. Inside the cabin, the dying embers in his stone fireplace suddenly flared to life the moment he crossed the threshold. Ezra froze, staring at flames that danced higher than they had any right to, fed by logs that should have been ash hours ago. The baby made a soft sound, not quite a cry, more like a sigh of contentment, and the fire settled into a steady, impossible warmth. "What are you?" Ezra breathed, settling into the rickety chair beside his workbench. His fingers trembled as he unwrapped the thin blanket someone had swaddled the child in. No identification, no note, nothing to explain how an infant had ended up buried in snow during the worst storm in decades. The baby's scent hit him then. Not the sour milk smell he expected, but something that made his wolf stir restlessly beneath his skin. It was the smell of pine forest older than memory, of snow that had never been touched, of power that hummed just beyond human understanding. His omega instincts, usually muted after years of suppression, suddenly roared to life with a protectiveness so fierce it left him gasping. Outside, the storm began to change. What had been chaotic wind and driving snow slowly organized itself into something that felt almost respectful, as if nature itself was rearranging around this impossible child. Ezra had seen many impossible things in his 23 years. He'd watched his own bones break and heal in minutes during his first shift. He'd felt the pack bonds snap when they cast him out, leaving a hollow ache that never quite faded. He'd survived 3 winters alone in country that killed experienced hunters. But this was something else entirely. The baby's tiny fingers wrapped around Ezra's thumb with surprising strength, and suddenly every candle in the cabin flickered to life simultaneously. Shadows danced across walls lined with his carved toys, wolves and bears and ravens that now seemed to watch the child with wooden eyes that gleamed too knowingly. "Okay," Ezra said softly, his voice steadier than he felt. "Okay, so you're special. That's fine. I can work with special." He'd been caring for wounded things since he was old enough to hold them. Orphaned fox kits, injured ravens, a wolf pup whose mother had been killed by hunters. His pack had always said his omega nature made him too soft, too nurturing for a world that demanded strength. They'd been wrong about many things, but his instincts had never steered him wrong when it came to protecting the vulnerable. The child's eyes found his, and Ezra felt something shift deep in his chest, a recognition that bypassed logic and spoke directly to parts of himself he'd thought were permanently broken. This baby needed him. More than that, this moment felt like the culmination of every choice that had brought him to this isolated mountain, to this ramshackle cabin, to this exact point where their paths crossed. He rose carefully, supporting the baby's head, as he'd learned to do with injured animals. "Let's get you fed and warm. Really warm, not whatever that supernatural furnace thing you're doing is." As if responding to his words, the baby's internal heat dimmed to something more normal, more human. But the fire continued to burn without fuel, and the candles flickered with flames that cast no wax drippings. Ezra moved through his small cabin with practiced efficiency, warming goat milk he'd traded for last week, testing the temperature against his wrist. Normal tasks, routine actions that helped ground him when everything else felt like it was spinning out of control. The baby watched him with those impossible eyes, tracking his movements with an intelligence no newborn should possess. When the milk was ready, the child latched onto the improvised bottle with desperate hunger, as if he hadn't eaten in days. Maybe he hadn't. Maybe he'd been lying in that snowdrift since the storm began, somehow surviving on whatever power kept him warm and breathing. The wind outside began to quiet, and Ezra realized with growing certainty that his life, such as it was, had just changed forever. The baby finished the bottle as dawn broke across the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. Ezra had dozed fitfully in his chair, startling awake every few minutes to check that the child was still breathing, still warm, still real. In the pale morning light, the events of the night before felt like a fever dream, except for the tiny weight in his arms and the fire that still burned without consuming a single log. He'd named the baby Ash while the storm raged, partly for the color of those shifting eyes, partly because it felt right in a way that bypassed rational thought. Now, watching Ash sleep with tiny fingers curled against his chest, Ezra tried to reconcile this moment with the harsh reality of his existence. His life followed patterns worn smooth by necessity. Every morning he checked his snares and the small greenhouse he'd cobbled together against the south wall of the cabin. 3 days a week he worked on his carvings, simple toys and trinkets he could trade for supplies. Once a month, weather permitting, he made the brutal 50-mile trek to Copper Falls, the nearest settlement, hauling his wares on a sled his wolf form could manage alone. It wasn't much of a life, but it was his. He'd built it carefully, deliberately, every choice designed to ensure he never had to depend on another person again. The isolation that would drive most people to madness had become his sanctuary. No pack dynamics to navigate, no alpha commands to resist, no expectations to disappoint. But babies changed everything. Ash stirred, making that soft sighing sound that had become familiar over the long night. The fire responded immediately, flaring brighter, and Ezra wondered how he was supposed to take a child who could apparently control elements into town for supplies. How did you explain flames that burned without fuel to people who barely tolerated him as it was? The trading post in Copper Falls served a rough crowd: miners, trappers, the occasional researcher brave enough to venture into the deep wilderness. They tolerated Ezra because his toys were well made and his prices were fair, but tolerance wasn't acceptance. He'd learned to keep his head down, conduct his business quickly, and leave before anyone started asking too many questions about why a young man lived alone in country that challenged survival experts. Martha Reeves, who ran the post, was probably the closest thing he had to a friend, though their relationship consisted mainly of fair trades and weather talk. She'd been kind enough to special order the medical supplies he'd needed when he first arrived, half dead from exposure and heartbreak. But even Martha would have questions about a baby, questions Ezra couldn't answer. He shifted carefully, trying not to wake Ash as he surveyed his meager supplies. Half a sack of flour, some dried beans, the last of his preserved meat. Enough goat milk for maybe 2 more bottles. In his previous life, before the pack, before the exile, he'd never had to worry about resources. Food appeared, clothes were provided, shelter was guaranteed. The pack took care of its own, until they decided you weren't one of their own anymore. The familiar ache of that rejection tried to surface, but Ash's presence somehow muted it. Ezra had spent 3 years nursing the wound of being cast out, replaying every moment of his final confrontation with Alpha Morrison. The ultimatum had been simple: accept the bond with Morrison's sadistic nephew or leave the pack permanently. There hadn't been a real choice. Submitting to Garrett would have destroyed him in ways that exile never could. But sitting here with Ash sleeping peacefully against his chest, Ezra felt something he hadn't experienced since leaving his pack: purpose beyond mere survival. The baby's eyes fluttered open, that impossible storm cloud gray that seemed to see too much. Ash's tiny hand found Ezra's finger again, and the touch sent warmth spiraling through him, not the supernatural heat from before, but something deeper, something that spoke to the Omega instincts he'd spent years suppressing. "You're going to complicate everything," Ezra murmured, but there was no regret in his voice. "I had a routine. Simple. Safe. Just me and the mountain and enough distance from everyone to keep us both protected." Ash made that soft sound again, and the candles flickered in response. Outside, Ezra could hear his usual morning visitors. The ravens who'd learned he sometimes had scraps to share, the fox family that denned nearby, the old wolf who occasionally watched from the tree line. His quiet life, his careful solitude, his hard-won peace, all of it about to change. But as Ash's eyes drifted closed again, and the fire settled into its impossible steady burn, Ezra realized he didn't want to go back. 3 years of safety hadn't healed the loneliness he'd refused to acknowledge. 3 years of routine hadn't filled the hollow space where his pack-bond used to be. Maybe some complications were worth embracing. The decision might have been easier if the change had come gradually. Instead, it announced itself with the sound of helicopters. Ezra's head snapped up from where he'd been watching Ash sleep, every instinct suddenly screaming danger. The rhythmic thrum of rotor blades cut through the mountain silence like a blade, growing louder by the second. In 3 years of isolation, he'd never heard aircraft this close to his remote valley. The nearest flight path was over 100 miles south, and emergency services didn't venture this deep into the wilderness without good reason. Ash's eyes flew open, those storm cloud irises immediately shifting to deep silver. The baby didn't cry. Instead, he went perfectly still with an alertness that was thoroughly unnatural for an infant less than 24 hours old. The fire in the hearth dimmed abruptly, as if responding to some unspoken command. Through the cabin's single window, Ezra caught the flash of black against the pale morning sky. Not rescue helicopters, these moved with military precision, maintaining formation as they swept across the peaks. 3 of them, sleek and predatory, their rotors churning up clouds of snow that glittered like scattered diamonds. "They're looking for you, aren't they?" Ezra whispered, instinctively drawing Ash closer to his chest. The baby's impossible warmth pressed against him, but now it felt less like comfort, and more like a target painted on both their backs. The helicopters circled wider, their search pattern methodical and thorough. Whoever was flying them knew what they were doing. More concerning, they had resources, money, authority, the kind of backing that suggested Ash's mysterious origins went far beyond an abandoned child. Ezra's mind raced through possibilities, none of them reassuring. Government agencies tracking supernatural anomalies, private military contractors following energy signatures, pack enforcers with access to human technology. Any of them would view an isolated Omega as expendable, an inconvenient witness to eliminate rather than question. His wolf stirred restlessly beneath his skin, caught between the urge to shift and run and the overwhelming need to protect what he now thought of as his child. 3 years of suppressing his dual nature made the internal conflict almost painful. His human mind catalogued escape routes and hiding places, while his wolf calculated fighting odds and territorial advantages. The helicopters made another pass, lower this time. Close enough that Ezra could see figures in the open doorways, equipment that looked like sensors or scanners trained on the valley below. They moved with the confidence of predators following a clear trail. One of them peeled away from the formation, angling directly toward his cabin. Shit. Ezra was already moving, wrapping Ash in the warmest blankets he could find while his mind automatically shifted into survival mode. His emergency pack hung by the door, basic supplies, emergency medicine, enough food for 3 days if he was careful. It wasn't much, but it was preparation born from years of knowing that staying in one place too long was a luxury he might not be able to afford. The helicopter's approach sent every wild creature in the area into hiding. Ravens that had been chattering in the pine trees fell silent. The fox family that denned near his woodpile vanished into their burrow. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. But Ash remained perfectly calm, those shifting eyes tracking the sound with unsettling focus. When Ezra lifted him, preparing to run, the baby's tiny hand pressed against his chest, and suddenly the world shifted. The temperature in the cabin plummeted. Not gradually, but all at once, like stepping into a freezer. Ezra's breath came out in sharp puffs, and frost began forming on the windows with impossible speed. Outside, the clear morning sky darkened ominously, clouds gathering from nowhere with supernatural swiftness. The helicopter's engine sound changed, becoming labored, uncertain. Through the rapidly fogging window, Ezra watched it struggle against wind that hadn't existed moments before. The pilot fought for control as downdrafts hammered the aircraft, forcing it to retreat toward safer airspace. All 3 helicopters pulled back, regrouping at a distance, while the localized storm Ash had somehow summoned made their approach impossible. But Ezra knew it was temporary. Whatever power the baby possessed, he was still an infant. This was instinct, not strategy. They would find another way. "We can't stay," Ezra murmured, though part of him rebelled against the thought. This cabin represented everything he'd built from nothing. His sanctuary, his refuge, his proof that he could survive alone. Leaving meant abandoning the first real home he'd known since his exile. But staying meant capture, questions, discovery, and something told him that whoever was hunting Ash wouldn't be satisfied with just taking the baby. The storm began to weaken as Ash's energy flagged, the supernatural clouds dissipating to reveal the helicopters still circling like patient vultures. Waiting. Ezra shouldered his pack, settled Ash securely against his chest, and opened the cabin door. The decision crystallized, with painful clarity. His quiet life was over. The routine that had sustained him, the careful isolation that had protected him, the hard-won peace he'd built from the wreckage of his old life. All of it ended the moment he chose the mysterious child over his own safety. The forest stretched before them, vast and unforgiving, offering the only escape route those helicopters couldn't easily follow. Behind them, his sanctuary waited empty, already becoming part of the past. Ezra's foot hesitated at the threshold, suspended between the warmth of his cabin and the brutal cold beyond. 3 years. 3 years of painstakingly building this life, carving safety from wilderness that killed the unprepared. His hand gripped the doorframe so tightly his knuckles went white. "I can't do this," he whispered, the words torn away by wind that carried the distant thrum of waiting helicopters. Against his chest, Ash stirred, those storm cloud eyes blinking open with unnatural awareness. The baby's gaze seemed to pierce right through him, seeing fears Ezra barely acknowledged himself. The rational part of his mind cataloged everything wrong with running. The temperature had dropped to 20 below, and that was before accounting for wind chill. He had maybe 3 days of supplies for himself, nothing designed for keeping an infant alive in deep wilderness. His nearest cache was 15 miles through terrain that would challenge an experienced mountaineer, let alone someone carrying a baby. But it wasn't just the physical impossibility that made his chest tight with panic. It was the memories. The last time he'd run, he'd lost everything. "You stupid Omega," Morrison's voice echoed in his mind, as clear as if the Alpha stood behind him now. "You think you can survive alone? You'll come crawling back within a month, begging us to take you back on any terms." Morrison had been wrong about the time frame, but the underlying threat haunted Ezra's nightmares. Omegas weren't built for isolation. Their biology, their instincts, their very nature required pack structure to function properly. Every book, every study, every piece of conventional wisdom said solitary Omegas went insane within years. Some nights, staring at his cabin's rough-hewn walls, Ezra wondered if they were right. Now he was contemplating dragging an impossibly powerful infant into that same isolation, except this time they'd be hunted. Whatever forces commanded those helicopters wouldn't give up. They'd follow, systematically searching every cave, every shelter, every bolt hole, until they found their prize. And what then? Ezra had survived exile because he'd been clever, cautious, invisible. But Ash was a beacon of supernatural energy that apparently summoned storms with his emotions. Stealth wasn't an option anymore. The baby made that soft sound again, and suddenly every candle in the cabin flared brighter. Shadows danced across the walls, highlighting the wooden toys Ezra had carved during long winter nights. Wolves and ravens and bears, each one a small masterpiece born from loneliness and the need to create something beautiful in a harsh world. He'd have to leave them all behind. "I'm not qualified for this," Ezra said aloud, his voice cracking. "I don't know how to protect you from whatever they want. I barely know how to protect myself." The helicopters circled closer, testing the edges of Ash's weakening storm. Soon they'd try another approach, and Ezra's temporary reprieve would end. He should move. Every second he delayed made escape harder. But his feet remained planted at the threshold, paralyzed by the enormity of what lay ahead. In the pack, he'd been expendable, an Omega whose refusal to submit had made him a liability. Here, alone, he'd at least been sufficient. He'd survived. He'd built something, however small. Now he was supposed to be a protector. a guardian, someone strong enough to keep a prophesied child safe from forces he couldn't even identify. The irony was bitter enough to taste. The same pack that had cast him out for being too weak, too soft, too nurturing, had been wrong about his survival. But maybe they'd been right about everything else. Maybe he really was just a broken omega playing at self-sufficiency, and the first real test would expose him as the fraud he'd always feared he was. Ash's tiny hand found his finger, gripping with surprising strength. The touch sent warmth spiraling through Ezra, not the supernatural heat from before, but something deeper, something that spoke to instincts he'd spent 3 years suppressing because acknowledging them hurt too much. The need to nurture, to protect, to shelter the vulnerable against a world that devoured the weak. "This is what you were made for," his omega whispered, the voice he'd tried so hard to silence. Not pack politics or alpha dominance games. This child needs you, but I'll fail him, Ezra breathed. Just like I failed my pack. Just like I failed everyone who ever believed I could be something more than a disappointment. The helicopter's engines grew louder. Decision time was running out, and Ezra remained frozen between his carefully constructed safety and a future that promised nothing but danger. Behind them, the cabin waited, warm, familiar, achievable. Everything he'd proven he could handle. Ahead lay the unknown, with a child whose power might save or damn them both. And Ezra, caught between past failures and future fears, couldn't make himself choose. Ash's grip on his finger tightened, and suddenly Ezra felt it, a pulse of pure trust that cut through his paralysis like lightning. The baby wasn't afraid. Storm cloud eyes gazed up at him with absolute faith, as if some ancient instinct recognized Ezra as sanctuary itself. "He's counting on you." The realization hit harder than any alpha's command ever had. Not because you're strong or proven or perfect, because you're here. Because you chose to stay when anyone else would have run. The helicopters banked toward them again, engines straining against the last whispers of Ash's supernatural storm. In minutes, maybe less, they'd be close enough to deploy ground teams. The window for escape was closing. Ezra stepped across the threshold. The cold hit like a physical blow, stealing his breath and immediately seeking every gap in his layered clothing. But his feet kept moving, carrying him away from the only home he'd known in 3 years. Behind him, the cabin door swung shut with a finality that echoed through his chest. No going back. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, something that felt suspiciously like relief flooded through his nervous system. He'd been half alive in that cabin. Surviving, yes, but not truly living. Just existing in the spaces between one day and the next. Carving toys for children he'd never meet. Trading with people who barely tolerated his presence. Safe. Routine. Empty. Ash made a soft sound against his chest, and Ezra realized the baby was watching the helicopters with that unnaturally alert gaze. For just a moment, those storm cloud eyes flashed silver white, and the wind picked up again, not the devastating downdrafts from before, but enough to make the aircraft struggle for stable flight patterns. "You're helping," Ezra murmured, adjusting his grip to keep Ash secure while he navigated the treacherous slope behind his cabin. "Good. We're in this together now." The words felt strange in his mouth. We. When was the last time he'd thought in terms of partnership? In the pack, he'd been isolated by his refusal to submit. In exile, he'd been alone by necessity. But now, with each step taking him further from safety, Ezra felt something he'd almost forgotten, the bone-deep satisfaction of being needed. His wolf stirred beneath his skin, finally aligned with his human decision. For 3 years, the two halves of his nature had existed in uncomfortable détente, his wolf wanting to seek out a pack while his human mind insisted on independence. Now both agreed, protect the child. Everything else was secondary. The forest closed around them like a living thing, ancient pines that had weathered centuries of storms, their branches heavy with snow that muffled sound and obscured sightlines. This was his territory, mapped through countless solitary runs when his wolf needed freedom from the cabin's walls. Every game trail, every water source, every natural shelter existed in his memory. The helicopters fell behind as Ezra chose paths too narrow for aerial observation. They'd have to land soon and follow on foot, but that bought him precious time to reach his first cache, to put distance between them and the hunters, to figure out what the hell he was supposed to do with a baby who could apparently control weather. Ash remained impossibly calm, those shifting eyes taking in their surroundings with an awareness that made Ezra's skin prickle. Most newborns could barely focus on objects inches away. This one seemed to be cataloging escape routes. "What are you?" Ezra asked quietly, then immediately felt foolish. Whatever Ash was, he was still an infant, still vulnerable, still dependent on Ezra's choices for survival. The irony wasn't lost on him. 24 hours ago, his biggest concern had been whether he had enough carved toys to trade for winter supplies. Now he was carrying a child who might be the most powerful supernatural being in existence, fleeing from forces he couldn't identify, abandoning everything he'd built. And for the first time in 3 years, he felt completely alive. The realization should have worried him more than it did. This was insane, dangerous, probably impossible. But every step away from his cabin felt like stepping away from a tomb he'd built around himself. His omega instincts, so long suppressed, hummed with purpose. This was what he'd been made for, not producing pups for some alpha's dynasty, but this, protecting the vulnerable, nurturing something precious, being the shield between innocence and a world that would destroy it. A branch cracked somewhere behind them, too heavy to be natural settling. The ground teams had landed. Ezra's pace quickened, his wolf's endurance carrying them deeper into terrain that would challenge even experienced trackers. Let them come. This was his mountain now, and he finally had something worth fighting for. Ahead, the wilderness stretched endless and unforgiving. Behind them, the hunting party closed in with methodical precision. Between them, an omega who'd found his purpose, and a child who might reshape the world. The threshold was crossed. The journey had begun. The sound of boots on snow reached Ezra's ears before he saw them. 3 figures in tactical gear moving through the forest with military precision. They weren't pack enforcers or government agents. These were something else entirely. Their movements too fluid, their coordination too perfect for ordinary humans. Ezra pressed himself against the trunk of a massive pine, using its bulk to shield both himself and Ash from view. The baby remained eerily quiet, as if sensing the danger, but those storm cloud eyes tracked the approaching figures with unsettling focus. Thermal signatures weak, one of the hunters spoke into a comm device, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. Whatever's masking the child's energy is sophisticated. Energy masking? Ezra's mind raced. He hadn't done anything to hide Ash's supernatural presence, didn't even know it was possible. Unless... He glanced down at the baby, whose tiny hand rested against his chest. Exactly where it had been when the helicopters first appeared, when that impossible storm had manifested from nowhere. Ash wasn't just creating weather phenomena. He was somehow using their physical contact to dampen his own supernatural signature. A child not even a week old, already demonstrating tactical awareness. "Sir," another hunter called softly. "Wolf tracks here. Large male, moving fast. Someone's definitely been through this area." Ezra's blood chilled. His boots left human prints, but his scent would tell a different story to anyone with enhanced senses. These weren't just skilled trackers, they were supernatural themselves. The lead hunter, a woman with silver-streaked hair and predator's eyes, crouched beside the trail Ezra had left. When she straightened, her expression was grim satisfaction. Omega wolf. Young male, maybe mid-20s. He's carrying the child. She touched something at her throat, a communication device Ezra couldn't identify. "Base, this is Alpha Team. We have confirmation. The Winter's Heart is with a local shifter." Winter's Heart. The phrase sent ice through Ezra's veins. Whatever Ash was, these hunters had a name for it. They'd been expecting him. "Orders are unchanged," the woman continued. "Retrieve the child. The Omega is expendable." Expendable. The word hit like a physical blow, bringing back every moment of rejection and dismissal from his old pack. But this time, fury rose alongside the hurt. They wanted to treat him like collateral damage? Let them try. Ezra began moving again, using the massive tree trunks as cover, while keeping the hunters in his peripheral vision. His wolf was pushing closer to the surface, instincts sharpening as adrenaline flooded his system. 3 years of careful control, of suppressing his dual nature to maintain sanity in isolation, cracked under the pressure of immediate threat. Behind him, the hunters spread into a search pattern, professional, methodical, closing off escape routes with practiced efficiency. But they were thinking like soldiers, not like wolves. Ezra's lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. Time to remind them which one of them actually belonged in these mountains. He shifted his grip on Ash, securing the baby against his chest with tactical precision born from years of solo survival runs. Then he did something he hadn't attempted in 3 years. He let his wolf rise just enough to blur the line between human and beast. His senses exploded into sharp focus. Every scent in the forest became a map. The hunters' locations, their equipment, the metal tang of weapons mixed with supernatural musk that confirmed his suspicions about their nature. His hearing expanded to catch heartbeats, breathing patterns, the subtle sounds of gear shifting against clothing. Most importantly, he could smell their confidence. They expected an easy hunt, a frightened Omega running blind through unfamiliar territory. They had no idea they were hunting a wolf on his own ground. Ezra moved through the forest like smoke, using terrain features the hunters couldn't see from their positions. A creek bed that would mask his scent, a game trail that curved behind their formation, rocky outcroppings that would muffle sound. "Lost the trail," one of the hunters reported, frustration creeping into his professional calm. "He can't have gone far carrying an infant," the woman replied. "Tighten the perimeter." But Ezra was already outside their perimeter, circling through territory mapped in his memory through countless solitary runs. His wolf's endurance, honed by 3 years of survival necessity, carried them over ground that would challenge even enhanced humans. Ash remained perfectly still against his chest, and Ezra realized the baby's supernatural heat was warming him more efficiently than any gear the hunters carried. Whatever Winter's heart meant, it apparently came with practical advantages for survival in extreme conditions. "This is Alpha Team," the woman's voice carried on the wind, growing fainter with distance. "Subject has evaded initial contact. Expanding search grid." Let them expand. Every minute they spent searching gave Ezra more distance, more options. He knew this mountain like his own heartbeat, knew every shelter, every cache, every hidden path that wouldn't show on their military-grade maps. For the first time since the helicopters appeared, Ezra allowed himself a moment of savage satisfaction. They'd called him expendable. Soon they'd learn what it cost to underestimate a wolf defending what mattered most. The euphoria of escaping the first hunting team lasted exactly 47 minutes. Ezra knew because he'd been counting time obsessively since leaving his cabin, using his wolf's internal clock to track how long they could maintain this pace before exhaustion made him sloppy. Ash added weight he wasn't used to carrying, and despite the baby's supernatural warmth, the sub-zero temperatures were steadily draining his energy reserves. When the second helicopter's rotors echoed off the mountain peaks, that careful time calculation became meaningless. "No," Ezra breathed, pressing deeper into the rocky overhang that had been providing temporary shelter. This was supposed to be a reprieve, a chance to reach his supply cache and plan their next move. Instead, the sound of aircraft engines multiplied above them like mechanical thunder. Through gaps in the stone, he watched 3 helicopters circle in coordinated patterns, not random searching. They adjusted tactics, expanding their grid to account for his greater mobility. Someone was learning from the first team's failure. Ash stirred against his chest, and for a terrifying moment those storm cloud eyes flashed that brilliant silver white again. The wind outside their shelter picked up, but instead of the chaotic downdrafts from before, this felt controlled, purposeful, as if the baby was testing the limits of his power. "Easy," Ezra whispered, instinctively adjusting his hold to provide more warmth and security. "We need to stay hidden right now." The silver faded from Ash's eyes, but not the unsettling awareness. The baby was learning, Ezra realized with a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. Every encounter, every threat was teaching him to weaponize abilities that defied natural law. What would a child that powerful become if raised by the people hunting him? What were they planning to do with a being who could control weather with emotional responses? The questions sent ice through Ezra's veins, but they also crystallized something that had been building since he'd first held Ash. This wasn't just about protecting an abandoned infant anymore. This was about preventing something catastrophic. Winter's heart. The name the hunters had used carried weight beyond simple identification. It suggested prophecy, destiny, forces larger than anything Ezra had imagined when he'd opened his cabin door to find a baby in the snow. And they'd called him expendable. The word still stung, but underneath the hurt, rage was building. Not the helpless fury he'd felt when his pack cast him out, but something colder, more focused. For 3 years, he'd accepted their judgment that he was worthless, too weak to matter. He'd built his exile around that belief, constructing a small, safe life that demanded nothing more than basic survival. But watching Ash's tiny hand curl trustingly around his finger, feeling the absolute faith radiating from someone so small and powerful, Ezra felt something shift in his chest, a door opening on possibilities he'd sealed shut when Morrison's final words had driven him into the wilderness. Maybe he wasn't pack material. Maybe he'd never be the kind of Omega Alphas fought over, or other wolves respected. But here, now, with a child whose very existence might reshape the supernatural world, none of that mattered. He was enough. He had to be, because Ash had no one else. The realization burned away 3 years of careful numbness, leaving raw purpose in its wake. Ezra had survived exile by making himself small, invisible, inconsequential. But protecting Winter's heart would require becoming something more, something dangerous, something the hunters hadn't planned for when they'd marked him expendable. The helicopters were settling into landing patterns on relatively flat terrain about 2 miles away. Close enough to deploy multiple teams, far enough to avoid the worst of any weather manipulation Ash might produce. Whoever commanded this operation understood both tactics and supernatural abilities. They'd be coming from multiple directions this time, coordinated, professional, with resources Ezra couldn't match and training he'd never received. Against that, he had intimate knowledge of the terrain, a wolf's enhanced senses, and desperation that cut deeper than bone. It should have been laughably inadequate. But as Ezra studied the approaching aircraft, feeling Ash's supernatural warmth against his chest and the mountain's familiar embrace around them, he found himself calculating angles and distances with predatory focus. His wolf stirred beneath his skin, no longer conflicted about their purpose. Let them come with their military precision and expendable judgments. They were about to discover what happened when someone with nothing left to lose found something worth dying for. The baby made that soft sound again, and this time Ezra heard it differently. Not helplessness, but communication. Trust offered and accepted. A bond forming that went deeper than simple protection. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. The helicopters finished landing. Soon the mountain would crawl with hunters seeking Winter's heart, and Ezra Chen, expendable Omega, felt his lips curve in anticipation. The first gunshot shattered the mountain silence like breaking glass. Ezra threw himself sideways as the bullet sparked off granite inches from where his head had been, his body moving on pure instinct, while his mind struggled to process what was happening. They weren't trying to capture him anymore. They were shooting to kill. Target acquired. A voice crackled through a comm device somewhere in the rocks above. Taking the shot. Another bullet whined past Ezra's ear as he rolled behind a boulder, clutching Ash against his chest with desperate care. The baby's eyes had gone that brilliant silver white again, and the wind was rising, not the controlled testing from before, but something wild and reactive. The temperature around them plummeted so fast Ezra's breath turned to ice crystals. Negative on the kill shot, the same voice reported, frustration bleeding through professional calm. Package is responding to threat level. Advise immediate extraction before weather conditions deteriorate further. Package. They were talking about Ash like cargo, something to be retrieved and delivered. The casual dehumanization hit Ezra like physical pain, but underneath the hurt, something far more dangerous was awakening. His wolf had been stirring for hours, but now it surged toward the surface with predatory intent. 3 years of careful suppression, of maintaining the delicate balance between human and beast in isolation, shattered under the pressure of immediate mortal threat. But this wasn't the desperate shift of a cornered animal. This was something else entirely. Something that felt ancient and purposeful flooding through his nervous system. His senses exploded beyond anything he'd experienced, not just enhanced hearing and scent, but awareness that seemed to extend beyond his physical form. He could feel the hunters moving through the forest like flames against his consciousness. 5 of them, spreading in tactical formation, but their supernatural signatures blazed with unnatural intensity. These weren't ordinary shifters. They carried something else, something that tasted of laboratories and forced evolution. "Sir," another voice called through the calm chatter. "Energy readings are spiking again. Both signatures this time. The Omega's not baseline. Not baseline." Ezra's mind reeled even as his body moved with fluid precision he'd never possessed, carrying them deeper into the rocky maze where rifles would be less effective. What did that mean? What were they reading from him that registered as unusual? But the questions dissolved as Ash made a sound Ezra had never heard before. Not the soft vocalizations of a normal infant, but something that resonated in frequencies that bypassed his ears entirely. The sound went straight to his bones, his blood, the deepest parts of his genetic memory, recognition, calling, ancient bonds snapping into place like puzzle pieces he'd never known were missing. Guardian. The word appeared in his mind without sound or source, carrying certainty that defied logic. Not his thought, but not entirely foreign either, as if something sleeping in his DNA had suddenly awakened to remember its purpose. "Thermal bloom on the western approach," a hunter reported, voice tight with concern. "Something's interfering with our equipment." Ezra glanced down to find frost spreading outward from where Ash rested against his chest, but instead of cold, he felt warmth flowing through their connection, power sharing, augmenting, creating something neither of them possessed alone. His wolf wasn't just rising to the surface anymore. It was transforming into something that had never existed in living memory. Enhanced strength flooded his limbs, but beyond the physical changes, his consciousness expanded. Every scent in the forest became a tactical map. Every sound revealed position and intent. Every shift in air pressure telegraphed movement before it happened. For the first time since finding Ash, Ezra understood why the hunters had labeled him expendable. They'd expected to find an ordinary Omega, frightened and overwhelmed, easy to eliminate once they secured their real target. Instead, they'd triggered the awakening of something their intelligence had never accounted for. A bloodline that had been dormant for generations, waiting for the right catalyst. "Alpha Team, fall back." The lead hunter's voice crackled with new urgency. "Package has activated defensive protocols. Repeat, fall back and reassess." But Ezra was done running. For 3 years, he'd survived by being small, invisible, unthreatening, by accepting that he was less than others, worth less than others. The pack had cast him out because he wouldn't submit to abuse, and he'd internalized their judgment that resistance made him worthless. Now, feeling power he'd never imagined coursing through his transformed physiology, Ezra finally understood the truth. He hadn't been too weak to belong. He'd been something else entirely, something they'd feared without understanding. Ash's tiny hand pressed against his heartbeat, and through that connection flowed absolute trust. Not the desperate faith of helplessness, but recognition between equals, between guardian and guarded. The mountain fell silent, except for wind that no longer felt natural. In that stillness, Ezra felt his fear transform into something that would have terrified his former pack. Let them come with their enhanced soldiers and expendable judgments. They were about to learn what happened when they threatened Winter's heart. The power flooding through Ezra's veins felt like liquid lightning, transforming every cell until he barely recognized his own body. But as he prepared to face the hunters with abilities he'd never dreamed possible, the mountain itself seemed to turn against him. The first tremor was subtle, a shift in the rock beneath his feet that could have been mistaken for settling stone. But Ezra's enhanced senses caught what his human awareness would have missed, the wrongness in that movement, the artificial precision that spoke of deliberate engineering rather than natural seismic activity. Seismic charges activated, a voice crackled through distant comm devices. Target zone destabilized, package extraction in 30 seconds. The rocky overhang above them groaned ominously. Hairline cracks appeared in granite that had weathered centuries of storms, spreading with mechanical inevitability. They'd turned his greatest advantage, intimate knowledge of the terrain, into a trap. Ezra launched himself toward the exit as the ceiling began its collapse, but the enhanced speed that should have carried them to safety faltered. The power coursing through his system sputtered like an engine running out of fuel, leaving him stumbling instead of flying through the debris field. Ash's cry pierced the thunder of falling stone, not the supernatural resonance from before, but the terrified wail of an ordinary infant. The silver light in his eyes flickered and died, leaving only human blue reflecting very human fear. Whatever had awakened between them was failing at the worst possible moment. "No, no, no!" Ezra gasped, throwing himself over Ash as granite shards rained down around them. A chunk of stone the size of his fist struck his shoulder, sending agony through his transformed nervous system. The guardian abilities that had felt like destiny moments before were dissolving like frost in sunlight. The tactical mistake hit him with devastating clarity. He'd been so focused on the hunter's supernatural signatures that he'd missed their technological advantages entirely. While he'd been preparing for a mystical confrontation between ancient bloodlines, they'd been rigging the mountain with modern explosives. Another tremor shook the overhang. Ezra managed 3 more steps before the floor beneath them gave way entirely. The fall lasted forever, and no time at all. Ezra twisted desperately to keep Ash protected, feeling ribs crack as he struck stone shelves during their tumble into the mountain's hidden depths. Each impact drove the breath from his lungs and scattered his thoughts. But somehow he managed to maintain his grip on the baby. They landed in a cavern Ezra had never known existed, his body absorbing the final impact with a wet crunch that suggested internal damage beyond his ability to assess. Darkness pressed around them, broken only by the pale light filtering through the collapse above, and in that faint illumination, Ezra saw his greatest fear made manifest. Ash wasn't moving. "Oh God, please no," Ezra whispered, his voice cracking as he shifted the baby with hands that shook despite his desperate attempts at steadiness. A trickle of blood ran from Ash's temple. Such a small injury, barely visible, but on an infant, it might as well have been a mortal wound. The baby's breathing was shallow, irregular. His supernatural warmth had faded to ordinary human body temperature, vulnerable to the mountain cold that was already seeping through the cavern walls. Without his powers, Ash was just what he appeared to be, a fragile newborn who'd been exposed to violence no child should survive. "I'm sorry," Ezra breathed against Ash's forehead, his own voice sounding foreign and broken. "I'm so sorry. I thought I could protect you." But protection required strength he didn't possess, abilities that had abandoned him when he needed them most. The guardian bloodline that had awakened so dramatically was silent now, leaving him to face the truth he'd been avoiding since this began. He was just an expendable Omega, a cast-off who'd been surviving alone, because he wasn't worth the effort it would take anyone else to find him. The hunters had been right from the beginning. He was collateral damage, an obstacle easily removed once they located their real objective. Rope dropped through the opening above them, followed by the controlled descent of tactical gear and enhanced soldiers. The lead hunter, the woman with silver-streaked hair, touched down in the cavern with predatory grace, her eyes immediately fixing on Ash's still form. "Package secured," she spoke into her throat calm. "Minor injuries, but stable. The Omega appears to have absorbed most of the impact damage. Appears to have absorbed. As if he'd been useful for something after all, as a living cushion for their real prize." The casual assessment hurt worse than his broken ribs. 2 more hunters descended, their movements coordinated and efficient. One carried medical equipment clearly designed for supernatural physiology. The other held restraints that would neutralize any lingering abilities Ezra might possess. Not that it mattered. He could barely lift his head, let alone mount any resistance. "Please," he managed as the medic reached for Ash. "He's hurt. Be careful with him." The woman tilted her head, studying Ezra with something that might have been curiosity. "You actually care about it. Interesting. Our intelligence suggested Omega attachment bonds were primarily self-preservation based. They saw Ash as an object, a weapon to be claimed and wielded. And there was nothing Ezra could do to stop them from taking the only thing that had mattered to him since his exile began. The restraints closed around his wrists with mechanical certainty, and Ezra Chen, guardian of nothing, protector of no one, watched Winter's heart disappear into enemy hands. The restraints bit into Ezra's wrists as the hunters disappeared up the rope with Ash, leaving him alone in the cavern with nothing but the echo of his failures. Blood pooled beneath him from injuries he couldn't assess, and each breath sent fire through his ribs. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the hollow ache where purpose used to live. Guardian. The word that had blazed through his consciousness during the awakening now felt like mockery. What kind of guardian let his charge be taken by enemies? What kind of protector failed at the moment when protection mattered most? The cavern fell silent, except for the drip of water somewhere in the darkness. Ezra closed his eyes and tried to summon even a flicker of the power that had transformed him earlier, but found only ordinary Omega physiology. Enhanced senses, yes, but nothing approaching the supernatural abilities that had briefly made him feel capable of changing everything. Maybe that's all it had ever been. Desperation manifesting as delusion, his mind creating impossible abilities because accepting powerlessness would have been unbearable. The hunters had real technology, real coordination, real strength. He'd had wishful thinking and a death wish. But as the thought formed, something shifted in the cavern's shadows. Not light exactly, but presence. Ancient and patient, as if the mountain itself had been waiting for this moment of absolute defeat to reveal its secrets. "You misunderstand what you are." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating through stone and bone alike. Not threatening, but vast in a way that made Ezra's supernatural encounters feel like whispers. "I'm nothing," he said aloud, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "I'm exactly what they said, expendable." Warmth spread through the cavern, and suddenly Ezra could see, not with his eyes, but with senses that extended beyond the physical. The walls around him weren't ordinary rock. They were carved with symbols that predated any human civilization, telling stories in languages that spoke directly to genetic memory. Stories of guardians who had walked between worlds when the supernatural clans were young. Protectors chosen not for strength or dominance, but for something far rarer, the ability to love without condition, to sacrifice without expectation, to stand against impossible odds not because victory was assured, but because standing itself was necessary. "The bloodline sleeps until awakened by absolute need," the presence explained. And Ezra realized he was experiencing ancestral memory, the accumulated wisdom of every guardian who had come before. It does not manifest to make you strong. It manifests to make you willing to be broken in service of what matters. Images flooded his consciousness. Guardians throughout history, none of them alphas or dominant forces. Omegas, mostly, and other cast-offs deemed unworthy by their societies. But each had stood at crucial moments when the supernatural world balanced on a knife's edge, offering themselves as shields for powers too important to lose. They hadn't all survived. Most hadn't. But their sacrifices had preserved the delicate balance that kept supernatural forces from consuming themselves or the human world. "Then I already failed," Ezra whispered. "They have him. Winter's heart is gone." "Is he?" The question came with sudden understanding. The connection Ezra had felt with Ash, the warmth, the power sharing, the sense of ancient bonds snapping into place that hadn't been broken by the fall or the capture. It had been severed deliberately by Ash himself to protect them both during the collapse, but the bond still existed, dormant and waiting. Ezra pressed his consciousness along that thread of connection and gasped at what he found. Ash was alive, unharmed, currently being examined in some kind of mobile medical facility. But more than that, the baby was aware in ways that defied everything Ezra thought he knew about infant consciousness. Winter's heart wasn't just a prophesied weapon. He was a person, with agency and intelligence that transcended physical age. And he had chosen Ezra as his guardian, a choice that created metaphysical bonds deeper than blood or magic. The hunters believe they possess him, the ancestral presence observed with something that might have been amusement. They do not understand that Winter's heart cannot be possessed, only partnered with. Their attempt to weaponize him will fail, but that failure may destroy everything they seek to control. Understanding hit like lightning. The hunters weren't just capturing a supernatural infant, they were trying to forcibly bond with a being whose power operated on principles they completely misunderstood. When their attempts failed, when Ash's abilities reacted against coercion instead of responding to it, the resulting chaos could shatter more than weather patterns. Every supernatural clan, every delicate treaty, every careful balance that kept their world hidden from human notice, all of it could unravel if Winter's heart's power erupted without a guardian's stabilizing presence. "How do I get to him?" Ezra asked, and felt the mountain respond to his question. The cavern wasn't a trap. It was a doorway. Ancient passages carved by guardians who had prepared for exactly this scenario opened in the stone around him, leading toward destinations he could sense rather than see. The restraints on his wrists dissolved like frost, and strength flowed back into his battered body. Not the wild power from before, but something steadier, more purposeful. He was still expendable, still broken, still everything his pack had judged him to be, but he was also chosen, and that changed everything. Ezra rose to his feet with fluid grace that defied his injuries, feeling power flow through channels in his DNA that had been carved by generations of guardians before him. The mountain passages beckoned, but he didn't move toward them immediately. The ancestral presence had shown him the scope of what was at stake, and raw determination wouldn't be enough to face it. "Gather, first," the ancient voice counseled. "A guardian's strength comes not from solitude, but from understanding what must be preserved." The carved walls pulsed with soft light, revealing chambers that branched off from the main cavern. Ezra followed instinct toward the nearest opening and found himself in what could only be described as an armory, but not for conventional weapons. Shelves carved directly from stone held artifacts that hummed with contained power, tools crafted by guardians across centuries for battles like the one he was about to face. His fingers closed around a pendant of black stone wrapped in silver wire, and knowledge flooded through him. A focusing crystal, designed to channel guardian abilities without the wild surges that had nearly consumed him earlier. Not a crutch, but a precision instrument that would let him access his bloodline's power without losing himself to it. Other items called to him with the same resonance. A cloak that would bend light around his form, not true invisibility, but close enough to matter. Boots that would let him move silently across any terrain. Simple things, practical rather than flashy, but each one crafted with the understanding that guardians survive through cunning rather than brute force. "Your pack judged you weak because you refused their alpha's bond," the presence observed, as Ezra equipped himself with tools that felt like extensions of his own body. They could not see that submission to corruption would have severed your connection to the bloodline entirely. Your resistance preserved what they would have destroyed. The words hit deeper than any physical healing. For 3 years, Ezra had carried the weight of that rejection, believing that his inability to accept abuse meant he was fundamentally flawed. Now he understood that his refusal had been instinctive protection of something far more valuable than pack membership. "The hunters," he said, testing the way the pendant focused his enhanced senses. "How many are there? What kind of opposition am I facing?" Images flowed through the stone walls in response. Not just the tactical squad that had taken Ash, but the larger organization behind them. The Synthesis Project, a coalition of rogue supernaturals and human military contractors who believed they could harness Winter's heart's power to impose their own version of order on both worlds. They had resources that dwarfed anything Ezra could muster alone. Enhanced soldiers, supernatural mercenaries, technology that blended the worst of both worlds. But they also had weaknesses born from fundamental misunderstanding of what they'd captured. Winter's heart cannot be compelled, the ancestral presence reminded him. Every attempt to force his cooperation will increase the instability of his power. They expect a weapon. They have taken a force of nature that responds only to love freely given. Ezra pressed his consciousness along the guardian bond again, and this time felt Ash's response. A flutter of awareness, quickly suppressed but unmistakably relieved. The baby knew his guardian was coming. More than that, he was actively working to destabilize his captor's efforts, his infant form hiding intelligence that was preparing for rescue. The connection carried more than comfort, though. Through Ash's enhanced senses, Ezra caught glimpses of the facility where they were holding him. Mobile command units disguised as research stations, positioned in a valley 50 miles northwest. Supernatural dampening fields to prevent unwanted manifestations. Medical equipment designed for beings whose physiology defied human understanding. And everywhere, the growing tension of people who'd expected to claim godlike power and instead found themselves babysitting an increasingly cranky infant whose diaper changes made their instruments malfunction. They have no idea what they're dealing with, Ezra murmured, and felt something that might have been laughter ripple through the mountain. Neither do you, fully, but that is the Guardian's advantage. You need not understand everything to protect what matters. The passages leading from the armory branched in 3 directions, each carved with symbols that conveyed destination and purpose. One led toward the hunter facility, a direct route through treacherous terrain that would put him behind enemy lines within hours. Another wound toward the nearest supernatural settlements, where allies might be found among those who remembered the old stories. The third passage pulsed with power that made Ezra's enhanced senses recoil. It led deeper into the mountain, toward something ancient and dangerous that the Guardians had apparently been protecting for millennia, something that could tip the balance of any conflict, but at costs that might make victory meaningless. Choose, the ancestral presence said simply, but choose with full understanding of what you risk and what you serve. Ezra looked down at the Guardian pendant, feeling its steady pulse against his palm. Ash was waiting, surrounded by people who saw him as an object rather than a person. Every moment of delay increased the chance that their misguided attempts would trigger catastrophe. But this wasn't just about rescue anymore. It was about preventing a war that could shatter both worlds. The expendable Omega straightened his shoulders and stepped toward the passage that would take him to his allies first. If he was going to save Winter's heart, he would need help from those who understood what they were truly fighting to preserve. The passage toward the supernatural settlements stretched ahead like a throat carved from living stone, sloping upward through the mountain's heart with purpose that transcended mere geology. Ezra moved through it with steady determination, the Guardian pendant's pulse synchronizing with his heartbeat as ancestral memories whispered guidance through each turn. He understood now what the presence had meant about choosing with full understanding. This wasn't just about rescuing Ash, though that remained his primary drive, the desperate need that made his chest tight, with each shared flicker of the baby's awareness through their bond. The Synthesis Project's fundamental misunderstanding of Winter's heart would cascade into catastrophe if left unchecked. Their attempts to weaponize power that operated on principles of love and protection would create exactly the kind of supernatural chaos that could expose both worlds to destruction. Every step carried the weight of consequences from his earlier choices. Refusing his pack's abusive alpha had led to exile, which led to finding Ash, which led to awakening abilities that made him the only person capable of preventing what was coming. The hunters had captured Winter's heart because Ezra had been too inexperienced with his guardian abilities to protect him properly. Now that failure demanded correction, but correction that acknowledged the scope of what was at stake. The passage opened into a natural cavern, where moonlight filtered through hidden cracks, and Ezra paused to press his consciousness along the guardian bond again. Ash's awareness touched his briefly, a wordless communication that carried both reassurance and urgency. The baby was unharmed, but increasingly agitated as his captor's attempts to study him grew more invasive. Medical equipment designed for supernatural physiology could only do so much when the subject was a prophesied being, whose power operated beyond conventional understanding. More concerning were the flashes of frustration Ezra sensed from the Synthesis Project personnel. They'd expected to acquire a weapon they could analyze and replicate. Instead, they'd captured an infant whose abilities seemed to activate randomly, whose presence made their supernatural dampening fields fluctuate unpredictably, whose very existence challenged everything they thought they knew about controlling supernatural forces. Time grows short, the ancestral presence murmured through the pendant's warm pulse. Their impatience will lead to escalation. Ezra knew what that meant. If the project couldn't understand Winter's heart through study, they would attempt forced activation of his abilities. Torture disguised as research, justified by the magnitude of what they believed they could achieve. The thought made his enhanced senses flare with protective fury that he carefully channeled into focus rather than rage. The passage continued upward, and soon Ezra caught familiar scents on the mountain air, wood smoke and herbs, the distinctive markers of supernatural communities that existed in the spaces between human settlement and true wilderness. The Thornwick Collective had established themselves in this region decades ago, refugees from various conflicts who'd found common ground in their desire for peace. If anyone would remember the old stories about guardians in Winter's heart, it would be them. But approaching them meant revealing himself, ending the anonymity that had protected him during 3 years of exile. The moment he appeared asking for help, word would spread through supernatural networks that the guardian bloodline had awakened. That knowledge would draw attention from more than potential allies. Ezra touched the pendant and felt his resolve crystallize. He'd spent too long hiding, too long believing that survival meant avoiding notice. The expendable Omega who'd been cast out for refusing corruption no longer existed. In his place stood someone chosen for purposes that transcended personal safety. The passage opened onto a ledge overlooking the Thornwick settlement, a cluster of buildings that seemed to grow naturally from the mountainside, designed with the organic curves that marked supernatural architecture. Lights flickered in windows, and Ezra's enhanced hearing caught fragments of conversation in multiple languages, the comfortable sounds of a community settling into evening routines. Below, he saw figures that confirmed the collective's reputation for accepting outcasts. Wolf shifters moved alongside Fey refugees, their children playing in moonlit gardens, while their parents worked on projects that blended technology with magic in ways human science couldn't comprehend. This was what the Guardian bloodline had been created to protect, not just power or prophecy, but the possibility of different supernatural clans finding harmony despite their differences. The Synthesis Project would destroy this. Their vision of order through dominance would shatter communities like Thornwick, reducing complex supernatural societies to resources for exploitation. Winter's heart's power in their hands wouldn't unite the clans, it would enslave them. Ezra stepped out of the passage and began his descent toward the settlement, each footfall carrying the weight of commitment to finishing what he'd started. The final confrontation was coming, and when it arrived, he would face it with allies who understood what preservation truly meant. The Guardian had chosen his path. Now came the consequences of walking it. The settlement's perimeter sensors detected him before he'd taken a dozen steps down the mountainside. Ezra felt the subtle shift in the air as ward stones activated, their protective enchantment scanning for threats with supernatural precision. He raised his hand slowly, letting his scent carry ahead of him. Omega Wolf, Guardian bloodline, no immediate aggression, and waited for the inevitable response. They came from 3 directions at once, moving with the coordinated efficiency of people who'd learned that survival meant taking no chances. 2 wolves in human form, a Fey scout whose pointed ears caught moonlight like knife blades, and something else that moved between shadow and substance in ways that made Ezra's enhanced senses recoil slightly. "Far from home, aren't you?" The lead wolf spoke with an accent that placed her origins somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, probably another pack refugee. Her nostrils flared as she caught the complex layers of his scent. Guardian bloodline. Haven't smelled that in decades. "I need to speak with your council," Ezra said, keeping his voice level despite the urgency clawing at his chest. Through the pendant's connection, he caught another flicker of Ash's distress. The baby's captors were growing more frustrated, with their inability to understand what they'd taken. "It's about Winter's heart." The effect was immediate. The Fey Scout's expression shifted from wariness to something approaching awe. The Shadow Walker solidified enough to reveal features that mixed human and something far older. Even the wolf's body language changed, defensive postures giving way to the kind of careful attention reserved for legends stepping out of stories. "Fuck," the lead wolf breathed. "You're serious." "The Synthesis Project has him," Ezra continued, feeling precious seconds slip away. "They think they can weaponize his power. When they fail, and they will fail, the backlash could shatter every treaty, every balance we've built. Communities like yours will be the first casualties." The Shadow Walker spoke for the first time, its voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from multiple throats. The prophecies speak of a guardian awakening alongside Winter's heart, but the bloodline was thought extinct. So was I, Ezra said grimly. Until 3 days ago, I was just an exile living alone in the mountains. Now I'm the only thing standing between that child and people who would turn him into a weapon of mass destruction. The wolves exchanged glances, pack-speak passing between them too quickly for Ezra to follow. The Phase Scout tilted her head, as if listening to voices only she could hear. The Shadow Walker simply stared at him with eyes that held depths older than the mountains themselves. "The council is in session," the lead wolf said finally. "Emergency gathering about strange energy readings from the north. Seems your project friends aren't as subtle as they think." They escorted him through the settlement's winding paths, past buildings that blended architectural styles from a dozen supernatural cultures. Children paused in their games to stare as he passed, some of them young enough that they probably recognized the scent of guardian bloodline from genetic memory, rather than conscious knowledge. Adults watched from doorways and windows, whispers following in his wake. The council hall occupied the settlement's heart, a circular structure whose walls seemed to shift between wood, stone, and something that might have been crystallized moonlight. Inside, representatives from the collective's various factions had already gathered around a table that pulsed with the same organic curves as the buildings outside. They were arguing when Ezra entered, heated discussion in multiple languages about sensor readings and territorial violations and the wisdom of avoiding involvement in conflicts beyond their borders. The conversation died as his scent reached them. An elderly woman who radiated the controlled power of a pack alpha was the first to speak. "Well," she said dryly, "that explains the energy signatures. Counselor Chen," the lead wolf said formally. "This is—" "I know what he is," the woman interrupted, her gaze fixed on Ezra with intensity that suggested she was seeing far more than his physical form. "The question is what he wants from us." Ezra stepped forward, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room. Representatives from 6 different supernatural factions, each with their own reasons for seeking refuge in the mountains, each carrying the hard-won wisdom that came from surviving conflicts they'd never asked to be part of. "I want your help saving a child," he said simply. "But more than that, I want your help preventing a war." He told them everything, finding Ash in the blizzard, the awakening of his guardian abilities, Kieran's arrival, and the revelations that followed, the attack and Ash's capture by the Synthesis Project. As he spoke, he felt the ancestral presence stirring through the pendant, lending weight to his words with power that made the very air in the room thicken. When he finished, silence stretched for long moments. Then the Shadow Walker leaned forward, its multiple voices harmonizing into something like a sigh. "The Guardian bloodline awakens only when the supernatural world stands at a breaking point," it said. "If Winter's heart has chosen you, then the prophecies are already in motion. The question isn't whether war is coming, it's whether we'll be ready for it." The final test wasn't just about rescuing Ash anymore. It was about proving that the old alliances could hold against forces that would remake both worlds according to their own twisted vision. The council chamber erupted in motion as alarms shrieked through the settlement's protective wards. Counselor Chen's eyes blazed amber as her wolf surged close to the surface, while the Shadow Walker dissolved into writhing darkness that tasted the air for threats. "They're here," Ezra snarled, the guardian pendant burning against his chest as hostile energy signatures flooded his enhanced senses. Through the bond with Ash, he felt a spike of terror that made his vision white out for a heartbeat. "They're using him to track me." The Synthesis Project had arrived in force, military vehicles equipped with supernatural dampening technology, enhanced soldiers whose scents carried the metallic tang of forced augmentation, and something else that made every supernatural in the room recoil. They'd brought Ash with them, using Winter's heart's unstable power as both bait and weapon. "Impossible," the Phase Scout breathed, her pointed ears tracking sounds beyond normal hearing. "Our wards should have—" "Your wards were designed to hide from other supernaturals," Ezra cut her off, already moving toward the chamber's exit. "Not from technology that treats our abilities like radio signals to be triangulated." Through the hall's crystalline walls, he caught glimpses of the assault unfolding. Soldiers in tactical gear surrounded the settlement, while hovering drones projected containment fields designed to prevent shape-shifting. The message was clear: surrender, the Guardian, or watch the entire community burn. But Ezra felt something else through the pendant's connection to ash. The baby's terror was giving way to rage, and Winter's heart's fury was making the very air around the project forces unstable. Ice formed spontaneously on their equipment. Electronics sparked and failed. The containment fields flickered as power that predated human understanding pushed against their artificial constraints. They cannot control him, the ancestral presence whispered urgently. Every moment of forced proximity increases the danger of cascade failure. Ezra knew what that meant. If Ash's power went completely unstable while surrounded by military-grade supernatural dampening technology, the resulting explosion would kill everyone within miles. The Synthesis Project thought they were holding a weapon. They were actually cradling a supernatural nuclear device, whose safety required the very love and protection they were denying him. "Get your people to the deep shelters," he told the council, his voice carrying authority that made Pack Alphas step aside. "Now." "Like hell," Counselor Chen snapped, but her protest died as she caught the scent of his escalating power. The Guardian bloodline wasn't just awakening anymore, it was preparing for war. "What are you planning? To end this before they kill us all," Ezra said grimly. He reached through the bond and found Ash's consciousness, offering comfort that cut through the baby's terror like sunlight through storm clouds. "I'm coming," he promised wordlessly. "Hold on just a little longer." The response nearly drove him to his knees. Ash's relief flooded the connection, but beneath it was something that made Ezra's blood freeze. Winter's heart wasn't just scared. He was dying. The project's attempts to study his abilities were draining his life force, their technology treating him like a battery, to be depleted, rather than a living being to be protected. Rage exploded through Ezra's system, and for the first time since awakening, he felt the full scope of what he'd inherited. Guardian powers that had slept for generations roared to life, turning his enhanced senses into weapons that could tear apart reality itself. The pendant blazed with light that made the council chamber's walls ring like struck crystal. Through the settlement, every supernatural felt the Guardian's fury awaken. Pack bonds throughout the collective strengthened as wolf shifters prepared for battle. Fey magic crackled through the air in defensive patterns older than human civilization. The Shadow Walker expanded into a form that existed in 7 dimensions simultaneously. But it was the ancestral presence that showed Ezra what he truly faced. Through the pendant's connection to eons of Guardian history, he saw the choice that would define everything: fight with restraint and risk losing Ash to technology designed to drain him dry, or unleash the full power of his bloodline and potentially destroy both the project forces and the innocent settlement caught between them. "There is a third path," the presence whispered, as Ezra stepped outside into moonlight that suddenly seemed pale compared to the Guardian pendant's radiance, but it requires perfect trust in what Winter's heart was truly born to do. Outside, soldiers raised weapons that hummed with supernatural dampening frequencies. Their leader stepped forward with a case that made Ezra's enhanced hearing catch the faint sound of an infant's labored breathing. "Guardian," the man called, his voice amplified by equipment that made the words echo off the mountainsides. "You have something that belongs to the future of both species. We're prepared to negotiate." Ezra looked at the case holding Ash, felt the baby's weakening life force through their bond, and made his choice. The ancestral presence had been right about trust, but not trust in negotiation or restraint. Trust in letting Winter's heart show the world exactly what happened when love was threatened by those who mistook power for control. The Guardian pendant blazed against Ezra's chest as he stepped into the no-man's land between the settlement and the project forces. Each footfall left prints in the snow that glowed with ancient power, and he felt the weight of every supernatural gaze watching from the shadows behind him. "I'll come with you," he called to the project leader, his voice carrying across the frozen mountainside with preternatural clarity. "But first, let me see him." The soldier's triumph was obvious even through his tactical helmet. "Smart choice, Guardian. The future will thank you for your cooperation." They brought the case forward, and Ezra's enhanced hearing caught the heartbreaking sound of Ash's weakened breathing. Through their bond, He felt the baby's life force flickering like a candle in a hurricane. The project's technology was literally draining Winter's heart to death in their attempts to understand him. But as they opened the containment unit, Ezra felt something else. The ancestral presence stirred through the pendant, and suddenly he understood what the third path truly meant. Not sacrifice of power or restraint or even his own life, but sacrifice of the very thing that had defined him since awakening, his need to control the outcome. Trust, the presence whispered one final time. Let Winter's heart be what he was born to be. Ezra knelt beside the case and placed his hand on Ash's tiny chest. The baby's eyes fluttered open, those impossible storm-gray orbs that shifted color like living weather, and recognition flooded their connection. Not just the recognition of a protector, but something deeper. Something that made Ezra's breath catch in his throat. Ash saw him, really saw him, with an awareness that shouldn't have been possible in an infant, but was exactly what the prophecies had promised. Winter's heart didn't need protection from the world's conflicts. He needed a guardian who trusted him enough to stop shielding him from his own destiny. "I'm sorry," Ezra whispered, and meant it more than he'd meant anything in his life. "I was so afraid of losing you that I forgot what you're capable of." He lifted his hand from Ash's chest and stepped back, deliberately removing himself from the protective radius he'd maintained since the blizzard. Around them, project soldiers raised their dampening weapons higher, their equipment humming with confidence that supernatural power could be contained through superior technology. They had no idea what they'd just unleashed. The change began as a shift in temperature that had nothing to do with the mountain winter. Ash's small body began to glow with light that made the aurora borealis look pale, and every piece of project technology within 100 yards started to malfunction. Not the violent failures Ezra had expected, but something far more unsettling. Their equipment simply stopped recognizing supernatural energy as something foreign to be suppressed. Winter's heart wasn't destroying their dampening fields. He was teaching them a new definition of natural. The lead soldier stumbled backward as his helmet displays flickered and died. "What the hell?" "He's not a weapon," Ezra said softly, watching in awe as Ash's power rippled outward in waves that touched every living thing on the mountainside. "He's an invitation." Through the settlement behind him, Ezra felt the collective's supernatural residents gasp in unison as barriers they'd carried their entire lives simply dissolved. Pack bonds strengthened beyond anything they'd thought possible. Fey magic flowed freely for the first time in generations. The Shadow Walker solidified into a form of impossible beauty that existed in perfect harmony across multiple dimensions simultaneously. But it was the project soldiers who provided the real revelation. One by one, their artificial augmentations began to evolve, technology and supernatural ability merging in ways that transcended both origins. Enhanced hearing became true telepathy. Tactical implants sparked with genuine magic. Weapons designed to suppress supernatural power transformed into tools that amplified it instead. "This is what he was born for," Ezra breathed, understanding flooding through him with the force of religious revelation. Not to unite the clans through conquest, but to show everyone, human and supernatural alike, that the barriers between us were never real. The project leader tore off his malfunctioning helmet, and Ezra saw features twisted with confusion and something that might have been terror. "This isn't what we wanted. This isn't controllable." "No," Ezra agreed, and smiled for the first time since Ash's capture. "It isn't." Winter's heart's power reached its crescendo, and suddenly every living being on the mountainside was connected, not through dominance or submission, but through the simple recognition that they were all part of something larger than their individual fears. Human and supernatural, predator and prey, guardian and ward, all of it revealed as artificial distinctions that had prevented them from seeing their true potential. Ezra felt his guardian abilities shift and expand, no longer focused on protection, but on nurturing the connections Ash was creating. The pendant's warmth spread through his entire being as he finally understood what he truly sacrificed, not his life or his power, but his assumption that love meant preventing those he cared about from facing their destiny. As the light faded and Ash settled into peaceful sleep, Ezra knelt beside the case once more. The baby was stronger now, his life force stabilized by the very act of using his abilities as they were meant to be used. "Hello, little one," Ezra whispered. "Ready to change the world?" The silence that followed was unlike anything Ezra had ever experienced. Not the tense quiet of predators circling prey, or the hushed expectancy before a storm, but something deeper, the profound stillness of a world fundamentally altered. Around the mountainside, Project soldiers stared at their transformed equipment with expressions ranging from wonder to terror. Their tactical gear no longer hummed with the harsh frequencies of supernatural suppression, but pulsed with gentle harmonics that seemed to breathe in rhythm with their heartbeats. One soldier tentatively touched his modified helmet and gasped as genuine empathic ability flooded through circuits that had been designed only for enhanced targeting. "Sir," the soldier whispered to his commanding officer, his voice thick with awe, "I can feel them. All of them. They're not monsters." The project leader, his face still uncovered, features slack with shock, took an unsteady step backward. Behind him, other soldiers were experiencing their own revelations. Enhanced hearing that had become true telepathy allowed them to sense the collective's emotions directly, not hostility or predatory hunger, but curiosity, caution, and beneath it all, a tentative hope that perhaps coexistence was possible after all. Ezra remained kneeling beside Ash's case, one hand hovering protectively over the sleeping baby, while his enhanced senses catalogued the cascading changes rippling outward from Winter's heart's awakening. Through the pendant's connection to generations of guardian knowledge, he understood that this moment had been prophesied for millennia, not as conquest or domination, but as the first step towards something unprecedented. From the settlement behind him came sounds of wonder as the collective's residents emerged from their defensive positions. Pack bonds that had been strained by centuries of hiding strengthened into something approaching telepathic unity. Fey magic, no longer constrained by the need for secrecy, painted aurora-like patterns across the sky in celebration. The Shadow Walker's multiple voices harmonized into something that might have been laughter or tears of joy. "What have you done?" the project leader managed, his augmented vision still sparking with impossible readings as it tried to process supernatural energy that now registered as perfectly natural. "Nothing," Ezra replied softly, his gaze never leaving Ash's peaceful face. "He did it himself. All I did was stop standing in his way." Counselor Chen approached cautiously, her wolf's enhanced senses drinking in the transformed atmosphere. Where moments before the air had been thick with potential violence, now it carried something Ezra had never expected to feel again, the scent of possibility. "Guardian," she said formally, though her voice carried warmth that hadn't been there during their first meeting. "The bonds are stabilizing. Whatever Winter's heart has done, it's not temporary. The barriers are truly down." Ezra nodded, feeling the truth of her words through his own expanded abilities. The connections Ash had forged weren't fragile links that would snap under pressure, but fundamental alterations to how consciousness itself operated in their vicinity. Human and supernatural awareness had merged into something greater than either could achieve alone, creating a template for coexistence that would ripple outward far beyond this mountainside. But even as wonder filled him, practical concerns pressed against his awareness. The project hadn't come here alone. They were part of a larger organization that viewed supernatural abilities as resources to be harvested or threats to be eliminated. Somewhere beyond the mountains, other forces were undoubtedly monitoring this operation's progress. "This is just the beginning," he murmured, more to himself than to the gathered witnesses. The project leader seemed to read his thoughts. The man's face cycled through confusion, fear, and something that might have been the first stirrings of understanding. "Our command structure. They'll want to know what happened here, how to replicate it." "They can't," Ezra said with quiet certainty. Winter's heart isn't a weapon to be studied or a power source to be tapped. He's a catalyst. And catalysts work through relationship, not force. As if summoned by the conversation, Kieran materialized from the shadows at the settlement's edge. The Alpha's approach was cautious, his enhanced senses clearly overwhelmed by the transformed energy signatures surrounding them all. When his gaze found Ash sleeping peacefully in the containment case, Relief flooded his features with an intensity that made Ezra's chest tighten. "Is he?" Kieran began. "Stronger than ever," Ezra confirmed, carefully lifting Ash from the case and feeling the baby's warm weight settle against his chest, like a missing piece clicking home. And apparently tired of having his potential underestimated by everyone who claims to love him, Kieran's mouth quirked in something that almost resembled a smile. "Sounds familiar." Around them, the standoff was dissolving as project soldiers and collective members began tentative conversations facilitated by their newfound ability to sense each other's true intentions. Fear was giving way to curiosity as ancient prejudices crumbled under the weight of direct empathic contact. Ezra looked down at Ash, whose storm-gray eyes had fluttered open to regard the transformed world with satisfaction that seemed far too knowing for an infant. "Well," he whispered to Winter's heart, "what's next, little revolutionary?" Ash's response came not in words but in a pulse of warmth that flooded through their bond, carrying images that made Ezra's breath catch. Not visions of the future, but something more immediate, a gentle insistence that pulled his attention toward the settlement's glowing lights. Home, the feeling seemed to say, time to go home. The word hit Ezra with unexpected force. Home. For most of his adult life, that had meant his isolated cabin, the place where he'd learned to survive, alone after his pack's rejection. But as he looked around the transformed mountainside, at project soldiers sharing wonder-struck conversations with werewolves, at fey magic painting welcome patterns in the sky, at Kieran approaching with careful hope in his eyes, he realized home had somehow become something larger. "The baby's right," Counselor Chen said, her enhanced hearing having caught Ash's wordless communication. "We should return to the settlement. There will be much to discuss, and the little one needs proper care after what he's been through." Ezra nodded, but found himself hesitating as the project leader stepped forward. The man's tactical gear still hummed with transformed energy, his augmented vision flickering between standard and supernatural spectrums as it adapted to its new capabilities. "Guardian," the officer said, his voice lacking the authoritative edge it had carried earlier. "My orders were to secure the Winter's Heart asset and return it to headquarters for study. But what I experienced here," he gestured helplessly at the peaceful scene around them, "how do I explain this to my superiors? How do I make them understand that their entire approach was wrong?" "You don't," Ezra replied gently, shifting Ash to a more comfortable position against his shoulder. "You show them. The same way he showed us." The man's augmented eyes widened as understanding dawned. "You're saying this effect, it can spread?" "Not through force or coercion," Kieran interjected, moving to Ezra's side with protective instincts that had clearly survived their earlier conflicts. "But through contact, through relationship." Winter's Heart didn't change the fundamental nature of supernatural abilities. He revealed what was always possible when barriers come down. Around them, the mixed group began moving toward the settlement in something that looked remarkably like a procession. Project soldiers walked alongside pack members, their enhanced equipment now serving as bridges rather than weapons. The Shadow Walker glided between dimensions, occasionally manifesting just long enough to offer directions to confused tactical teams. Even the Fae had abandoned their usual aloofness, weaving light patterns that guided everyone safely through the treacherous mountain paths. As they walked, Ezra felt the pendant's warmth pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. The ancestral presence was quieter now, no longer urgent with warnings or cosmic knowledge, but content to rest like a blessing against his chest. The guardian bloodline had awakened not to fight ancient battles, but to shepherd in something unprecedented, a future where the supernatural and mundane could coexist without one dominating the other. "You're different," Kieran observed quietly as they navigated a particularly steep section of trail. "Not just the power awakening. Something else." Ezra considered the observation, surprised to find he couldn't immediately argue. The Omega, who had stumbled upon a dying baby in the snow, felt like a different person entirely, not because his circumstances had changed, but because his understanding of himself had fundamentally shifted. "I think I finally stopped running," he said eventually, "from my pack's rejection, from connection, from the possibility that I might matter to someone." Ash didn't just show the world what unity could look like. He showed me that love isn't about preventing the people you care about from facing their destiny. They reached the settlement's edge as the first hints of dawn touched the mountain peaks. The buildings glowed with warm light, and Ezra could smell coffee brewing, bread baking, the sense of a community preparing to welcome unexpected guests. Through his enhanced senses, he felt the collective's residents bustling with nervous excitement, their transformed pack bonds humming with curiosity about the soldiers who no longer registered as threats. Ash stirred against his shoulder, making soft, contented sounds that drew smiles from everyone within hearing range. Even the most battle-hardened project operative seemed incapable of viewing Winter's heart as anything other than what he was, a baby who had somehow managed to save them all from their own fears. "So what happens now?" the project leader asked as they approached the settlement's main building. "My mission parameters didn't exactly account for peaceful resolution." Ezra looked down at Ash, then around at the impossible gathering they'd become. Werewolves and humans, soldiers and civilians, ancient magic and modern technology, all existing in harmony that should have been fantasy. "Now," he said, feeling the truth of the words as he spoke them, "we figure out how to build a world worthy of what he's shown us is possible." The settlement's doors opened, spilling warmth and light, and the scent of fresh-baked welcome into the mountain air. For the first time since that blizzard-torn night when he'd found an impossible baby in the snow, Ezra stepped forward without looking back. He was finally ready to come home, the new beginning. 6 months later, Ezra woke to the sound of Ash's delighted babbling and the scent of Kieran making breakfast in the kitchen below. Sunlight streamed through the windows of their shared cabin, not his old isolated sanctuary, but a new home built at the heart of what the outside world had begun calling the Harmony Settlement. He padded downstairs to find Ash sitting in his high chair, chubby hands reaching toward floating sparkles of light that danced just beyond his grasp. At 8 months old, Winter's heart was developing exactly like any normal baby, except for the way flowers bloomed when he laughed and electronics evolved themselves to better serve their users whenever he touched them. "Good morning, little revolutionary," Ezra murmured, pressing a kiss to Ash's downy head before accepting the coffee Kieran handed him. The Alpha's presence no longer triggered complicated feelings about power dynamics or pack hierarchies. Somewhere between Ash's awakening and the gradual building of their life together, those old wounds had healed into something stronger. "The morning briefing's in an hour," Kieran said, settling beside them at the table they'd built with their own hands. 3 more government delegations requesting tours, and Dr. Martinez thinks she's ready to publish her preliminary findings about the consciousness integration effects. Ezra nodded, watching through the window as the settlement bustled with morning activity. Former project soldiers worked alongside pack members to expand the community gardens. Fey magic helped human engineers design buildings that existed in perfect harmony with the mountain ecosystem. The Shadow Walker had become something of a local celebrity, offering interdimensional courier services that were revolutionizing global communication. What amazed Ezra most wasn't the magic itself, but how quickly it had all become simply normal. Children who had never seen supernatural abilities were growing up thinking telepathic pack bonds and technology that responded to emotional needs were just how the world worked. Adults were discovering capabilities they'd never known they possessed as the barriers between human and supernatural consciousness continued to dissolve. "Remember when our biggest worry was finding enough firewood to last the winter?" Ezra mused, earning a soft chuckle from Kieran. "Now we're trying to figure out how to help world governments adapt to the fact that their citizens are spontaneously developing empathic abilities." Kieran's expression grew thoughtful. "Sometimes I wonder if we're moving too fast." "We're moving at exactly the pace we need to," Ezra replied, the certainty rising from depths he was still learning to trust. The Guardian knowledge had settled into quiet wisdom rather than urgent warnings, but it still guided him when doubt crept in. Ash isn't forcing change. He's revealing what was always possible. We're just finally brave enough to accept it. As if summoned by his name, Ash turned toward them with a grin that could have powered the entire settlement. His storm-gray eyes held depths that sometimes seemed ancient, but his delight in simple things, the taste of mashed bananas, the way sunbeams felt on his skin, the sound of Ezra's voice singing lullabies, was purely, joyfully infantile. Through the windows came the sound of approaching vehicles, Not military transports this time, but civilian cars carrying families who had heard about the settlement and wanted to experience the harmony for themselves. They came skeptical and left transformed, carrying seeds of possibility back to their own communities. The ripple effect is accelerating, Kieran observed, following Ezra's gaze to the visitors. Dr. Chen estimates that within another year, the consciousness integration will reach critical mass. There won't be any going back to the old barriers. Ezra felt a flutter of the old anxiety. The omega instinct to hide, to protect, to keep precious things safely contained. But when he looked down at Ash, who was now attempting to share his breakfast with a butterfly that had wandered in through the open window, that fear simply dissolved. "Good," he said, and meant it completely. The morning briefing revealed more of the same cautious hope from government officials, breakthrough discoveries from researchers studying the integration effects, and requests for guidance from communities experiencing their own spontaneous awakenings. The project leader, now calling himself David rather than his military designation, had become an unlikely advocate, using his insider knowledge to help ease the transition for other supernatural suppression organizations. But it was the letter from Ezra's old pack that provided the day's most significant moment. His fingers trembled slightly as he read the Alpha's formal request for reconciliation, the acknowledgement that they had been wrong to cast him out, and the invitation to return home with full honors restored. "What will you tell them?" Kieran asked gently. Ezra looked around the settlement's community center, where Ash was being delightedly fussed over by a dozen different caregivers, representing every conceivable supernatural ability. He thought of his cabin in the mountains, where he'd learned to survive alone, and of this new place where he discovered what it meant to truly belong. "I'll tell them," he said, settling Ash back into his arms and feeling the baby's contentment pulse through their bond, "that I'm already home." Outside, the mountain peaks caught the afternoon light like a promise. Winter's heart gurgled happily, and somewhere in the distance, another barrier fell.